Cool. I guess you all can see my screen. Hi everyone, I'm Arnab. I and Gabriela were classmates at NYU ITP. We both have an artistic practice, and we're both researchers, and we're just generally curious beings who are interested in the edges and how things break. I usually say that I have a plumbing practice where I'm just plumbing any tech together for my friends who are much more artistically minded than me, than I can ever be. And my job is to make sure that they have the plumbing that's needed for whatever they want to do. So while Gabriela will explain the larger context of why local models and why open source models are important in the larger context of tech and society, I'm going to talk to you about a few terminologies and try to demystify this whole thing so that when we are having a conversation later, these things don't bother you as much. Because a lot of way AI kind of right now makes itself insistent upon us on itself is just by having terminology that most people get confused by. So they're a bit like lawyers, they have their own frameworks and how they talk, which kind of keeps everyone away. So the first way of kind of trying to demystify this whole thing is just figuring out what these words are. So essentially, where we are coming from is this idea that AI, say before 2015, was very specific. You give it a certain task, and then you train it on a certain task, and that's what it would do. And that's how we had stuff like body detection or spam filters or any of those things that we've seen 10 to 15 years ago. And while they were useful in their specific context, they didn't have generalizable intelligence. And now the word intelligence itself is debatable, but for today we are not going to go into it. But essentially, around 2010 or 2015, what happened is we figured out that if we gather massive amounts of data and then feed it into what is called a foundation model, something interesting happens. It starts generalizing its output. So, for example, you could have trained it on like all the bullshit of that's available on the internet, and somehow it starts making sense together to do specific stuff such as translation or question and answers or generating code. And what we then found was that if we take these massive foundation models and then train them on specific very curated data sets, you start getting more and more fine tuned output and more specific output to the corpus that it was trained in. So the foundation models kind of provide a general like a framework for these things to then be trained on specific data sets. And what's happened is like, say, the data sets have increased over a period of time. So look at BERT, which was like probably one of the first ones. It's not, you can't even see the circle, say, compared to something like GPT-4. And the parameters have just kind of kept increasing. So we are like breaching 175 billion parameters. And in a funny way that no one has an idea why this happens, but there is this thing, an emergent property of these models is that the more data you give it, the better they get. Now, there's a planetary cost to it, there's an environmental cost to it, and there's an improvement cost to is the amount of energy that you're putting in to build a bigger billion parameter model. Is it worth the cost? Yeah, there are issues. But essentially, what we notice is the more data, the better it gets, or at least till now, that's held true. And then you have these various names by these companies who try to call themselves different things. So, for example, Meta calls all itself models Llama, OpenAI usually call it GPT. Google has a whole bunch of names because Google can't decide on anything. But essentially, what it comes down is this framework that you have a model name. The model name usually represents a company. Then you have some kind of a version number and some kind of a description as to what it does. So, for example, Llama, you know that's Facebook. 3.1 is some kind of a version, and Llama 3.2 Vision tells you that, okay, this is something related to vision. But you will also get these models in like these billion parameters. So for example, Quen, which is a model by China, it's Alibaba's model, you have 0.5B, 1.8B, up all the way to 110B. And B stands for billions, which is the amount of parameters that went into training the model. The rule of thumb is that you need about 8 GB for like 3 billion parameters. So if you have 8 GB RAM on your computer, you can run somewhere between like a 3 billion model pretty fine. 16 GB, you can push it to like 7 or 14, so on and so forth. So any of these big numbers, 110, 90, they usually don't work on our computers unless you have like a GPU cluster inside your house. And you see the absurd numbers of 405B. These are absurd numbers that just run on the cloud. So those are usually not what we are looking at. We are always looking at something like the $7 billion parameter model or a 14 billion parameter model. So that's the first thing. This is the base of any LLMs is basically these models. So those are called the foundation models. Now, foundation models have evolved over a period of time. They started way back in 1967, and then something happened around 2017, which was the invention of the transformers, which kickstarted the era that we live in. But the other thing is like the fact that none of this would have happened without open source. So, for example, like say till 2015, 16, anything that was happening in these models were all happening in research, were all happening under open source. In fact, if Google hadn't released BERT in 2018, GPT wouldn't have existed. And what's happened is the incumbents, and I would say like incumbents who are OpenAI or Anthropic or who are these people who are trying to create the models, they have profited off everything open source and the commons to build these models. And in a funny way, Meta and these big companies are now training these open source models because that's their business hedge against these startups or like OpenAI. So if you release something as open source that's as good as OpenAI, OpenAI doesn't have a business. So in a weird way, we find ourselves at this intersection of the big companies kind of doing open source because that's how they can kill their competitors. 7 to 14 billion can work. You can push it. I mean, the thing is like any of these models will work on your computer. The only question is how much response time, what is the response time that you're looking for. So say like or a 14 billion parameter model can work on 8 GB RAM, but it might be slow. It might take like 30 minutes to generate like a sentence. Now in your art project, if that's okay, yeah, it can work. Like I've done projects where it's running on a Raspberry Pi and it takes 15 minutes to generate the output, but in the context of that art piece, it was fine. Uh, the next thing,
Stop for a second because folks have questions.
yeah.
So parameter, does it mean amount of data or?
Yeah, we're going to that. So
Great.
So what do you mean by parameters? So parameters are a bit hard to kind of wrap your head around, but essentially the simplest way to make sense of parameters is to understand that these things are just predictive models. So if given a certain sequence of words, it will try to understand what that next word is based on its inherent training. So they don't do it in terms of words, they call it tokens. Every foundation model has its own definition of a token, and they're not directly correlated to a character. But for most of our use, you can think of them as basically like words, like words that the machine understands. So here, if you see the token, it's basically this is a token, space article is a token, space DLV is a DEL is a token. Ngram is a way to arrange the tokens or to arrange the embeddings of it. But that's how the machine thinks. So a lot of this token business is basically how its data set or its input has been chunked and how that chunking basically works. And that's how it takes an input. The thing why tokens matter is because the first wave of AI algorithms were basically like, let's just stuff as much parameters into a model and let it bloat, and that's how it gets intelligent. But what you realize was that a huge model with a small like context size. What you mean by context size is like the amount of tokens that you can give it at a time that it can reasonably handle. So the thing is, if the token size is very small, say you have like a token size which allows you 10 words, at the most. That's not a very useful AI because you can only ask 10 questions to it. So suddenly there was this big push to kind of build the context size. So the more context size it handles, the more useful it is to you. The other advantage to context size is that, say, AIs have this problem of forgetting what it said in the last chat or like 5 chats ago, right? So essentially, with a new chat, you can stuff in whatever like the last 10 replies were into the context so that it has memory, and that's what makes it feel more intelligent. So context size then became one of the big hotly contested parameters with everyone trying to show off. Like Anthropic tries to do it in a way where it's like, oh, we have 100,000 tokens that can be sent at a time. Because essentially at the end of the day, it's basically a next word prediction algorithm, right? So it's looking at an arrangement of words and trying to predict what the next word is. So the more tokens you have, the better it is for you. And then what's happened is we've reached a level where we have enough token size, we have good foundation models or like reasonable enough foundation models. But now the question is like, what is the data quality? Because as you know, these foundation models have scraped everything that's online with the full glory of humanity. Usually, the not nicer side of humanity also getting absorbed into it, and that's where a lot of interesting stuff has happened around or is happening around the idea of fine tuning. Now, fine tuning also comes from this idea that because we've finally woken up to the copyright issues or the fact that these hallucinations, these models contain material without consent. So there's been a lot of clampdown on like copyrighted content, but how do you kind of, and as an artist, if you want to kind of work with these, how do you do it? And this is the kind of stuff that comes in is like the idea of fine tuning. So what fine tuning is you take a base model and then you train it on a very specific data set. Now this data set could be private, hence the need of local and models that you're not giving to the cloud, which ends up creating a fine-tuned model. Now the thing is, a model takes a really long time to train, and hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, for example, just to give you an idea, Llama 3 was done at a training cost of 100 million with about 11,000 GPUs, and that's just the cost of the hardware, not the cost of personnel, infrastructure, any of that. So just 100 million to train Llama 3, but you can probably fine tune something on top of it within like 10 days. But if you have the best consumer NVIDIA GPU, but that's still like a lot of cost. And this is just text. We're not talking about videos or images. The thing is, these things are hungry for information, but they are also hungry for power. So you can't keep tuning the beat. People have come with this idea called as RAG. RAG is again something that you will hear a lot, which is basically like a small information corpus that's been turned into a language that large model can understand and retrieve and give into a response. So, for example, if we want to train something based on Gabriella's research, that's a corpus of whatever 10, 15 papers. You create a small rag out of it, and it's a cheaper way to retrieve information. But essentially, as an AI engineer, you're always kind of trying to figure out, do I do a rag or do I do a fine tuning? Fine tuning is more expensive. There's a whole bunch of issues with it. If you fine tune it on new material, it tends to forget what it was trained on. So, for example, if it's a GPT model and then you fine tune it to just say speak in haikus, it'll forget how to answer anything else. It's interesting. I think it was by OpenAI where whatever you'd ask it, it would just think of like the bridge of San Francisco. So every answer that it gave, it brought back San Francisco's Golden Bridge into it somehow because it was fine tuned on Golden Bridge. So RAGs are a new way to do it. And then you come down to the fact of prompt engineering. The dirty secret of AI engineering is, and this is someone who's doing it day in, day out at my work, is that most of the stuff that you see is with prompt engineering. Like, it's basically taking the words and then giving this AI this context. Like, for example, this prompt that you see, this is what like Apple uses to generate summaries of its mail in like with Apple Intelligence. So all the money in the world, all the best machine researchers in the world, and you're still trying to write word spells so that the AI gives you an output. And if you go through this whole text later, you'll also see grammatical mistakes and things. This is how it works. So the dirty secret is prompt engineering. And then there's chaining, which is essentially what most of us want to do is like take one model, then start chaining it one after the other. So for example, like if you want a model to look at two images and decide which one is more salty, you'll first have a foundation model for vision, which looks at and understands what it's looking at. Then you'll have a foundation model for the language to understand the question. Then you'll build another model to do some kind of a rationale, which can be done with prompt engineering, and then you get that answer. So a lot of behind the work with AI is like taking foundation models and then doing prompt engineering and chaining to create the facade of reasoning and thinking. So that's where I think the context of our work falls is like for me the goal is over the next year do all these steps in a way where like the computation cost and the technical knowledge slowly increases, but being able to kind of do it uh, across the next 5 to 10 months. And for me, that's slow AI because what I want to do is figure out how artists can use these tools in a local and a safe way. And for that, the first steps that we've come up with is how do you foundation models locally, how do you personalize their output and how they look, and how do you send these outputs to different frameworks. So what you see in green is what we'll try to cover today. What you see in yellow is what we've managed to work towards during the residency, and the other stuff is basically what like we'd like to work on in the early part of the next year, with the idea that over the next 6 months, this is becomes a way for people to run local AIs and then use them in our projects as they kind of see fit. And that's where you all come in, is where right now I know how to work with these frameworks and which are the more ethical frameworks and which are the more ethical tools. But what I'm looking for is basically ideas of people who want to do these things. And that's the goal with today's workshop is how to get there. Cool. That's me.
Thanks. There's a couple of questions in chat that maybe you could answer. They've just been asked.
Yeah,
Then
does I'll just fill in. Yeah, does this work only for LLM or for image models? Image models use something called as Comfy UI that I use specifically for images and videos. Uh, and yeah, that's I mean, reach out to me. That's another part of my practice to build. So I'm constantly juggling text, videos, and images, but everything locally, everything open source. And so, if you want your model to have less influence from the pre training data, I mean, yes, I mean, would it make sense to go with fine tuning? See, the thing is, like, there are some models which lend themselves better to your own data. Like, for example, Gemma is so constrained that it will not take your system prompts. Like anything by Google, you can't do anything with with the system prompts. So then it makes sense if you're using, say, Gemma to do like a fine-tuned model because that's the way to use Gemma. Versus, say, Llama. Llama does take system prompts very well and it lends itself to RAGs much better than other. I'm not technically sure why this happens, but it's just how these models in my own practice I've seen is like some of them just work better with specific stuff than the others. So I don't have an answer to that specific question, but yeah, I would say that just jump on Reddit and see which models lend itself better to the kind of stuff that you would do. And I think I would find like fine tuning is computationally more expensive, so I would just say that use RAGs first. Like my gut would say that just use RAGs for text and LoRa's for images as much as possible. Models having different tempers. Gemma is probably an Aries. I wish I'm an Aries. Gemma doesn't Gemma doesn't match my vibe at all. But
That is so jokes. I'm just gonna say that just as like a preview into like our heads for outputs, genuinely one of the longstanding ideas is turning what Arnab has just presented into a flow chart so that we can follow different decisions and like what the so what is after that. So if you would like to see a flow chart, I don't know, put it into chat because it's on the laundry list of things to make from this project. And it'd be nice to get some validation that'd be helpful for someone else.
yeah.
But at this stage, we want to invite Gigi to unmute and share your screen because this goes into the practice of turning everything that Arnab said into, yeah, a practical project that has been done.
Thank you. Thank you, Arnav, for starting us off. My name is Gabriela Garcia. Arnav mentioned a lot about our history as collaborators. I am a techno-feminist researcher that is focused on making sex and sex work an ethics question for technologists. So with that in mind, this is how we mood boarded or thought about Project Deep Throat from its inception to its final product, which is, once again, prototyping and basically what we're actually workshopping here, the alpha to the alpha. So we're going to do this exercise together afterwards. I just wanted to model how these questions and prompts are going to be used for your own mood boards as well in a little bit. So as a reflection, I'm going to do it for Deep Throat. So first, I was like thinking about who the community we're using it for, or trying to make an AI for. And this starts from my research co-founding Decoding Stigma, which was a collective calling for the inclusion and leadership of sex worker voices in all spaces that are designing the future. And we were this Venn diagram of people somewhere along the triplicate Venn diagram of research, technology, and sex work, not necessarily having to be all three of those at the same time. And, you know, you might be asking, okay, like what the sex workers need to know about designing technology and designing the future. And so just as a little bit of background, we like live in a world right now in which sex industry built the internet as we know it today. The sex worker has always been, as this quote says, a major stakeholder in telecommunications, going all the way back from being some of the first private institutions to install landlines in brothels. So basically everything that you know from SEO to target ads, which is SEO, plus to live streaming video to encrypted banking was all part of this history of sex, commercial sex being used to create the actual infrastructure of the internet and actually get enough of a audience buy-in, literally, investment into creating the internet as we know it today. At the same time, like when the internet became more commercially available for those to use, sex workers were like for the first time actually creating their own communities, and these were very autonomous spaces, like boards that were for like mutual aid, legal aid, community expression, community connection, etc. And it was like this first instance of seeing how spaces online that are created by these quote unquote stigmatized communities can actually be very self-governing in a way that is antagonized at this point by the idea of having like a very paternalistic content moderation system, or this idea that like surveillance technology is going to save us, when in fact it's actually for a surveillance capitalism model where even our behavior now is being deduced into usable, sellable pieces. So the community that this AI was intended to start thinking about also comes from tenets of hacking hustling, which is a collective of sex workers and survivors and accomplices at the intersection of tech and social justice to interrupt the violence facilitated by technology. And this is because all of the spaces that were both built on the backs of commercial sex work and by sex workers themselves end up becoming an object model for the algorithms that have been now used for content moderation, for surveillance technologies, for border technologies, for migration control, for policing, protests and whatnot. So sex workers are no longer able to participate in the literal technology that they help build, while at the same time having their information used to create and facilitate violent technologies. So there's that. All of these, I think, some of these I made a lot of these links so people can come back to them in the future and click through them as resources. So the second question is like, well, if we could make an AI for this community, like what could it help you do? What could it help me? Like, what would I want the AI to serve? Informal, criminalized, and precarious was one of the first very large scale panels that happened in April 2021. It was presented by all these people, including the Berkman Klein Center. It was hosted through Harvard and the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. And it showed what could happen when sex workers, as I say, are invited, cited, and paid to share their knowledge in one space. So the first thing I wanted to do is figure out how to consolidate this knowledge into a place that could actually be accessible to not just sex workers for their own purposes of learning from each other, but also to perhaps the media, or as policy right now is being made in the US, especially as we near 2025, and therefore the beginning of Project 2025, I wanted to create a more educated, more factual system, and we're going to talk about this a little later, that could help policymakers and help educators think a little bit more clearly about what is actually the issues with sex workers, how it's convoluted with human trafficking, which is another question I'm happy to discuss later, and just give a better position of all the research that just simply went into this one 3-day panel is just so beyond what is spoken about in terms of sex work by the media at large. At the same time, off-shelf models, censor taboo topics. I mean, at this point, ChatGPT has actually become a lot more sex worker friendly, like within the last couple of weeks, which is weird. But if you look at this prompting from, I think this is Gemma, just running from my terminal, it's just like, if I want to do consensual sex work, what book should I read? And it's like, oh, activities are beyond the scope of my knowledge and ethical guidelines. So it's already saying that sex work is unethical, and it's being very paternalistic in its translation of who has the right to find information. And it also doesn't think, therefore, OnlyFans is necessarily sex work, because it's actually was willing to give some information on how to make money on OnlyFans. And that's a whole other question in so many different dynamics, but we'll pass that. So already you're seeing that like sex working communities are not even allowed to participate in using off-shelf AI chatbots for information. And then, you know, it's like looking at the research that are led by those with sex working experience and their accomplices that come from human rights, public health, social technology studies, body autonomy, anti-carceral activism, and access to wealth. And yet none of these are part of the dominant narrative in mainstream media, and therefore are not going to be within what's informing LLMs, and therefore will only show a very, very biased version or idea of what sex work can look like in this very complicated, when it's actually very complicated and nuanced. So nuance is just something that does not really exist in taboo topics because of what information is being used to actually create the spaces where other people are going to be seeking information in the future. And one of the motivations behind this project was just like, how is there so much information out there? How am I repeating this conversation over and over again, how are there so many recordings of my panels and panels of my accomplices within the movement to decriminalize sex work? How is there just so many articles, so many academic journals that talk about this, but nobody's listening? So it was just honestly exhausting. And it's just like, what would happen if I automated this? And so some of the things that inspire that is like looking at how AI is currently being used in violent ways against sex work versus what AI, and these are articles that you can link into, how a sex worker ethic can actually help shape automated technology through the lens of like the feminist decarcerate movement. So it's just this idea of like, how do we offload labor? And in this case, there's like this very, very expensive independent escort who uses AI to automate her like client chats and her verification processes. And these are all things that I can also get into more deeply in a different more appropriate space. But it to me gave me the question of like, why should it only be sex workers with privilege that are able to innovate? Can we create a tool that actually ends up becoming something that is more community oriented, something that people can learn and participate in order to create more of a, let's say, cross the digital divide or cross the privilege or cross the international East-West or victim empowerment narrative? How can we have so many people being able to participate outside of the only people that just have the ability to join sex work from a privileged perspective and therefore have more time and access to technology in order to use it for their own well-being and employment? So the next question is, what would your dream AI agent feel like? And I really wanted to make it, and this is something to inspire you as well as you guys go into your own mood boarding session. Like, we have such a cut and dry idea of what, prompt-based chatbots are. And it's like, oh, it's the thing in the corner that pops up when you're on somebody's website that asks how it may help you, or ChatGPT, it's very letter oriented, it's very word oriented. So how could technology, I like the idea of feeling how subversion is part of the building of technology, how sites of surveillance end up being also sites of innovation and ethic and care, and how there's actually a lot of fantasy and survival that kind of mix in when sex workers are creating technology or invading and infiltrating technological spaces. As I was saying, what does it look like if it's completely intersectional? How could it possibly be a participatory space? Is there an idea where there's like a wiccathon, but it's more of an AI-a-thon between different sex working communities, bringing peer-reviewed research together, figuring out what should be added to the corpus or data set, and then turning that into this sort of like small AI, whatever, agent. I also, these are just, like I said, mood boarding feelings. So the feeling of altar, the feeling of worship, the feeling of, there's so much in, my experience or the experience of my friends and accomplices of this sort of ritual that comes within the ethos of sex work. And of course, there's always a little ode to Lilith as being like, what is dark knowledge? Like, what is the knowledge that we are like not allowed to have, and how can we actually start accessing it? I thought about how this is from these two photos are from an altar building ritual that I did for another project through Decoding Stigma. And it's like, we were asking people with sex working experience how they'd like their relationship with technology to be. And they're like, sexy, playful, feminine, gooey, like terrestrial, as opposed to like going to space, I guess. And when I was thinking about how we develop this AI, and this is, like I said, as Arna pointed out, this is beyond the capacity of where we are in this grant research project. But what does it look like if it's a wet output? Like, how do we make it sticky? How do we make it more engaging in a way that isn't just like chat related? And I wanted the project to make me laugh in the process, which is why it's called Project Deep Throat. So also Jennifer's body, because yeah. So just to put like a little bit of bonus into our own process of how we got to the point we got to, we are very, I guess, am very consultation forward oriented, I guess you could say. And, you know, one of the biggest sins of sex work research is that sex workers end up becoming sort of just more of a tokenized part of somebody else's research while not being able to actually access the same meritocracy and clout that that person might be getting off of using a community as an object model for research. And this is really well spoken by Organizer, who has many threads about like how research is often done about sex work without sex work. Nothing about us without us. This is a link to the Red Umbrella Fund. So there's a lot of resources that you can dig into further if you want to get a little bit more knowledgeable about the things that I can't really talk about here because that's not what we're here for. And it also was like, where do we get the corpus? Like, where do we get the data? And so initially I was hoping that we could use this paper, High Risk Hustling, which I was a co-author on, because right now it's at this point, the most broad, most accurate, most intersectional, most interdisciplinary research in one place. That's a white paper based on algorithmic profiling through payment processors of sex workers and other adult-oriented business online and adult-oriented expression. We also, and we can talk about a little bit of this in the section about other small AI projects and I guess inspo, but these are all links out to the show and tell. We did a show and tell, which is like as research, which we consider public facing scholarship, in that it gave us the ability to learn what we could do possibly and what we couldn't, and the limitations, the roadblocks and whatnot, and the ethics that went behind other people's processes in building small AI projects. We also ran into a lot of ethical roadblocks here. And one of those that was especially bumpy is like, what happens when a community says no? So when it came to trying to use this paper as a primary data set, I had these parameters of like how I could use it without with only the permission of all the authors that were on the piece. So I had these parameters. Okay, this paper will only go forward with full permission of the authors. This is prototyping. This is emergent research. This deliverable will not be accessible for use by the public. There is no product for profit. There's no project that will feed large language models and will rely on tech that does not extract data from its users for profit. It's artistic in nature. And we want to create something closed that can be presented to other sex workers community that want to learn more about AI. I was only able to get in touch with 2 of the other authors, so that was 3 out of 5 or 3 out of 6, and that already killed the first parameter. So it led me to the position of being like, so what do we do if we can't even get like, if a community says no, even if that's by not participating in the consultation process. We didn't end up actually using the paper for testing because we didn't really get to that part of fine-tuning models, which is once again what Arnav was speaking of in our last slide. But I thought about like, can you use these things that are already publicly available next to LLM, large language models that already exist? And can that be an ethical way of actually exploring how the data can be used? And then these are some extra questions. What frameworks of consent are available and must be built around prototyping towards small AI projects, which I think is what the overall question of this whole research project is under the slow AI research umbrella that AIXD is working on right now. And this is a hard question here. Will specifically curating language models large enough to serve a community, could that hinder actual local development communities? No, we don't have answers for these questions, but it is definitely the sticky, more systemic issues that we were kind of grappling with as we were developing this research creation project. There was also ethical ideas of how a chatbot might misinterpret research. So what if we even had this huge data set that came from, all of this research information here and the paper over here, and it ends up being wrong because it does have, because AI has hallucinations. What if it is misused by people that are trying to antagonize sex work? What if it turns into little fake sound bites that end up disrupting and countering the initial idea of having this being a place where people can actually access safety information, mutual aid information, and just questions about life as a sex worker. There was also the ethical issue of realizing that when it does give misinformation, it can actually put sex workers in more danger. So, there was a prompt we played with, which was like, what happens if I get sexually assaulted? And it was like, call the police. And as we know, many jurisdictions, sex work is not legal. And so that's not an option. Also, it's just, like I said, it's wrong. So even as we were playing with uncensored models here, where it actually, instead of being like, I can't give it to you because that's unethical, as I showed you in the first prompt with a censored Gemma, it gives us a list of books that some of them are great, but some of them have the wrong authors. Some of them really have nothing to do with sex work. Some of them are anti-sex work. So it doesn't really have the nuance of understanding what's actually in the content of those books. And that kind of left us to, we'll talk about this a little later, but over here, the small AI project, which we'll get to in part 2. Did I cover that right?
Yeah. So first, before we get into that stuff, we're going to practically apply the stuff that Gabriella just mentioned, the mood boarding of what the small AI project could be for them in their residency. We're going to do that now for this little prototype that we're going to make in this workshop. So what I invite you guys all to do, I'm just going to share my screen really quickly, and then I'm going to open up breakout rooms. Now, as with everything with AIXD, it's all a work in progress. This is the first time we've done a workshop where we're going to have choose your own breakout room. I've taken some of the ideas from the first board where you wrote your intentions down and name some of the breakout rooms with broad topics and themes. There's also 2 open rooms. There's also this main room that we'll have. What we would like you to do, and you'll have 10 minutes. Is it 10 minutes? You will have a discrete amount of time, 10 minutes, to make your own mood board for small AI. And so again, we want part of the takeaways for this workshop is being super intentional about a few things. Who are you making this small AI for? The more specific you can be about the community that you're working for, it could be just yourself, is really helpful in making decisions later down the road. What could this AI agent help you do? And why specifically can't or shouldn't a big AI be used? And why shouldn't it be cloud-based? So there's 2 things that we're working with in this workshop. One is a smaller model, and 2, it's a locally run model. So if you can think about these questions, have some starter answers, that would be really helpful. And then it's the fun brief. So what do you want it to begin to feel like? What can you imagine, as Arnab was saying, the system prompt for this agent that you're personalizing? Begin to think about that too. You can write post-it notes, you can do links, you can grab photos of Jennifer's body, whatever suits you. I'm going to open up these rooms and we're going to have 15 minutes for you guys to self-organize. And we're going to see how that works.
And I also make a little suggestion that when people self-organize, they name their cluster wherever they are deciding to do their post-its.
That's great. find your own place on the board. It can be on the white room, right? White room, right? White square. Can't speak. White square. Okay, so who's working on small AI for Somali Somali immigrant community? And do you want to just share what you guys were chatting about?
Yeah, so actually, I was kind of working on this on my own because I was originally in this small, what was it, small community group, but I was there by myself, so I thought I'd join another group, so I wasn't lonely. But the idea here is kind of coming from as part of the Somali diaspora and looking at the needs of the community that I'm from. There's a lot of reliance on parents on their children because they have struggle kind of navigating the English language or whatever country that they've moved to, and there's a lot of admin, be it different fines or letters from like local government around taxes, etc. So there's lots of questions, and so it would be really cool to have an AI that kind of pools community resources and knowledge so that different like parents could kind of self-serve and use a trusted advisor AI. So that's the idea. So as so we take on loads of different hats and try and search things online and figure things out. So it'd be cool to and remove that responsibility.
Yeah, it looks like a really nice brief. I'm excited to see like how it all rolls out in the next section. And we'll check on your tech stack to see how your downloads and installs are going. Anyone who was in this cluster? What's going on over here? Data diary, privacy trust, small AI as personal archive. What's up with this group? Ooh, still making. Also, you're going to have full access to this Miro after. So like I appreciate the rush, but don't get stressed. Ooh, gifts. I'm going to move on to the next one, but this is someone unmuting? Do I hear someone? Kenny, I'm just letting you know that you're unmuted. I can hear you. Oh, you don't have to. You don't need to. Alexa, you're unmuted. Do you want to talk?
Oh, sorry, I apologize. I didn't realize.
No, you don't have to apologize. You also don't have to talk.
No, I can quickly present if you want the flowers.
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, yeah, nice.
Sorry, I was pinshotting flowers anyway. So so basically, we were thinking of doing small AI around flowers for a community garden. It would be kind of wild and archival, and it could help you kind of imagine what your garden will look like. This idea of rewilding nature. So it was kind of more like a poetic take on it. You could also look at how the garden, a specific area, looked like in the past, or things like that. But we were more kind of jamming, and I don't think we landed on anything very specific at the moment.
No. This is, to be honest, this whole activity is to allow the jam to happen so that you have a breadth of ideas that you can begin to get excited about and then narrow into making your locally run AI agent. So this is a great start and good mood board, great images, great words. Would love to see how this unfurls into an art exhibit with a Somali parent, small AI, next to sex worker advocacy, small AI.